Pixar's hit 2006 animated film Cars follows a hot-hooded young race car named Lightning McQueen who, by a stroke of bad luck, ends up stranded in an almost ghost town on Route 66. Radiator Springs, located on a once bustling arterial road reduced to obsolescence by the construction of more convenient interstate highways. Radiator Springs denizens remember when the town used to have prospects, an open road ahead of it, and they want to put it back on the map. After the town's kooky cast teaches Lightning McQueen the value of slowing your roll, McQueen gives Radiator Springs his celebrity endorsement, and the town is revived, back on the map, its former glory restored and its economy booming again. Cars come from all over to appreciate the culture and kicks organic to Route 66. Happy ending. Except this is a scam and lies. The problems that plague Radiator Springs are symptoms of a terminally diseased global economic system. Okay, hear me out. The film portrays the decline of Radiator Springs as a consequence of America's cultural amnesia. Sally says cars used to drive along the only road that was available to them to have a great time.
40 years ago, that interstate down there didn't exist. Back then, cars came across the country a whole different way. Well, the road didn't cut through the land like that interstate. It moved with the land, it rose, it fell, it curved.
Cars used to drive on cement roads that moved with the land. Cars used to move with the land! So, Pixar's movie chalks up the disappearance of entire communities along Route 66 to Carmerica forgetting its values, forgetting to value the simple things in life. And the solution? Simply teach an impatient celebrity that there's more to life than convenience, and the rest of the country will follow his influence and swoop in to save your dying way of life. The film represents the ailment plaguing American communities since the 1950s, which was caused by a few things that are, quite frankly, out of Lightning McQueen's four-wheel drive. First, the shift in domestic tourism and trade down the interstates instead of the older highways amputated many rural communities from the country's economy. Towns that had been built around the traffic that flowed down these roads were gradually left to decay. That is to say, people were left to the passage of time as forces too big to really see carried all the money and possibilities for prosperity away from their homes. Second, mining and steel manufacturing sectors disappeared. Well, they were actively outsourced to factories that could get away with paying their workers low wages because they were built in essentially lawless enterprise zones in South and Southeast Asia. Oopsies! These fundamental shifts in America's economy and infrastructure resulted in a devastating exodus of people from regions whose economies had entirely developed around those sectors. The Rust Belt in the northeasterly, midwesterly region of the United States was like the epicenter of this economic earthquake, but obviously it impacted the entire country. Also, I'm aware that I'm simplifying this. If you're an economist or a historian, no, you're not. Cars was meant to be a love letter to communities along Route 66. The animators actually stitched together historical landmarks from various places along the road and used them for the backdrop of Radiator Springs. Okay, look, a movie doesn't have to dive into the economic forces that led to the slow and stressful death of communities across the United States. However, the message this film is sending out does come across as insensitive, considering who is making it and who is most of America. The same system that created the aesthetic of Route 66 as it is now is the same one that allowed Disney to become richer and more powerful than some countries. With the advance of capitalism, these communities were swept into the country's dustiest nooks and crannies. They disappeared because of economic changes that resulted from a fundamental reprioritization in the country's governance, not cultural amnesia on the part of America's middle and working class. And for one of the companies that thrived from shifting most of its labor from America to other countries that are being exploited, to have the audacity to make a movie that sighs disappointedly at everybody else for not liking the aesthetic of the pores enough, it just rubs me the wrong way. In short, Cars is an offensive nightmare of a film. It writes a myth about how American culture changed, glossing over the way that those in power actively prioritized economic growth over the well-being of their people, to the extent that entire regions were left to freeze and shrivel up without any social support once they no longer served as centers for the generation of capital. I watch Cars now, and I feel no joy. I think of other car villages across Car America, and I realize most places aren't lucky enough to have a famous race car swoop in and save them. Well, what Pixar was too cowardly to address, the game Night in the Woods tackles head on. Today, I'm gonna argue that this video game and this Disney movie are set in the same universe. Haha, a game theory.
The following Showtime entertainment special deals with mature subject matter and contains some strong language. Parental guidance is advised.
Night in the Woods was released in 2017 to widespread critical acclaim, and it was developed by a team called Infinite Fall. After dropping out of university, Mae Borowski, the main character, catches a bus home to Possum Springs, the small town she grew up in. Possum Springs is not a place full of promise. Young people who have realized that the future has abandoned the town are moving away to find better opportunities. The elders they leave behind are like ghosts, haunting Possum Springs, holding the same festivals with the same people every year, in the hopes that someone will remember that the town exists. Once a mining town with a strong and successful union, Possum Springs is bursting with murals, memorials, and statues in honor of the town's heyday. The way these characters talk about the miners makes them seem like legendary heroes from a mythical golden past. To me, the murals look like Renaissance paintings of Greek gods or battles or parliamentary debates. They're highly nostalgic, and they show the town is fixated on a very specific moment in its own history. By the time Mae comes home, what strikes her is how much has changed since she's left. Businesses are closing, people are leaving in search of work, and what's left of the young people is a group of mopey and bored edgelords hanging out in tunnels and playing with garbage. People seem to stay in Possum Springs either because they have no other option, they have a clearly misguided belief that one day their home is going to prosper again, or because of the magnetic commitment to their families that pulls them back when they do try to leave. Mae constantly runs into a little collective of busybodies who seem to run everything in Possum Springs. They're the city council, but I think they're also the historical society and maybe even the Chamber of Commerce. What you hear from them over and over again is that they want to attract the attention of the market, as if it has eyeballs, as if all you have to do to bring opportunity back to a dying community is be worthy of the market's attention. As if all you need is a celebrity stumbling into your town who's going to fall in love with it. Ka-chow! What the city council doesn't understand is the market is never going to afford the town any more notice than it already has. The market didn't leave because the townspeople lost track of their own merits. The world moved on. And nobody in Possum Springs really got the memo. It's like nobody's supposed to be here anymore, but nobody has anywhere else to be. So if Mae was blessed with such a precious opportunity to get the fuck out, why did she come back? Well, she doesn't really have a good answer. Mae doesn't have any motivation, she has no ambition, no drive. The game starts at her rock bottom. Mae sinks even lower as some inexplicable feeling of dread drags her down. Initially, she seems excited to be back. She's momentarily lifted out of whatever dispirited state that she was in at college. But Mae's life in Possum Springs is dreary. She gets up every day, hangs out, and then when it's time to go to sleep, she goes to sleep. Kicking around starts to lose its appeal as her friends and family get more and more frustrated with her for not explaining herself. She has no plan, she has no explanation, she's just depressed. Mae's prodigal return is a surprise and an offense to so many people around her. She doesn't know it, but her parents sacrificed a lot to get her out of town, taking a risky loan to fund her education. She also doesn't appreciate what others would have given to be in her place. Like her childhood best friend Bee. Bee desperately wants to go to university, but she's unable to leave her father behind. The two of them barely have enough money to keep their family business going, so Bee's stuck unofficially running it by herself while her dad kinda lies around. Bee doesn't get to reap any of the awards because her dad is still monopolizing control over the business, so all she can really do is fantasize about the life that she could have had at college. One of my favorite moments with Bee is when you find out that she makes a habit of visiting a nearby college town on weekends. She likes to pretend that she's enrolled as a student there to get a taste of the good life and to mingle with her peers and just escape her reality for a moment. It's really heartbreaking. So when Mae comes back without any good explanation as to why she dropped out of school, doing nothing but casually shrugging off people's questions and trying to settle into the life that she had there before and pretend that she's never really left, B's pissed. What a wonderful privilege to be able to go and get an education. How could May squander something like that? Meanwhile, May's other good friend, Greg, is planning to move away from Possum Springs with his delightful boyfriend, Angus. I love Angus. May's kinda bummed out because she expected to be able to fall into her old patterns with Greg. Instead, he's working? Even her home life is different. The Borowskis are panicking, quietly, that all of their financial sacrifices to get May to college came to nothing. May left behind everything they worked for. And why? Why didn't she see it through? Well, because May is a baby. Dropping out of university and moving back in with your parents doesn't have to be a step backwards in your growth and development, obviously. For some people, that's just the right choice. May seems to have dropped out specifically so she can act like a kid again, though. As you walk through the first screen of the game, away from the bus station, you'll have to make May climb an old jungle gym. A kid's toy. Ostensibly, this is the game's way of introducing the player to all the platforming that you have to do, which is necessary because so many of the game's platforms blend into the general scenery. This section also has thematic importance, though. Like, if you want to see everything that the game has to offer, you're gonna have to make May climb up and around the town the same way that she climbs the jungle gym. It's childish. This moment also has symbolic meaning. May doesn't jump to finding a job or help her parents with chores. She jumps to treat the town, the adult world, like a jungle gym, like a kid zone. Being in Possum Springs, for May, is a reversion to her childhood. I'm not the first person to point the symbolism around this out. Grace Lee explains that, in the same way the English script is read from left, the beginning of the sentence, to the right, the end of the sentence, Western cultures have a bias where we think of time from left to right, like the past is to the left and the future is to the right. Throughout the game, May is constantly moving to the left, away from the future and towards the past. And because May treats the whole town like she treats the jungle gym, it's like she's constantly going through this personal regression ritual into a past version of herself that doesn't fit in with the present space anymore. Because, as we've noticed, Possum Springs has not been static the whole time that May has been gone. So, by coming home, May's also becoming a little shithead kid in a timeline that has already gotten rid of her little shithead kid spot. Possum Springs only has room for May insofar as she can act like a responsible adult. Exactly what genre this game falls into has been the subject of debate since its release. Obviously, there are elements of platforming here. It feels, to me, like a point-and-click adventure game, but whatever resemblance Night in the Woods bears to point-and-click games is superficial. It doesn't really have any substantial connection in its design with any other games in the genre. It's light on adventure and puzzles and heavier on dialogue, so it's more reminiscent of a visual novel in some ways. Overall, the gameplay is minimal, with most of the action restricted to collecting objects and information that will help you trigger new conversations with people as you progress. There are also random little mini-games that break up the tedium. Some people have suggested that Night in the Woods is a walking simulator, which doesn't feel accurate to me. For one thing, that's not a genre. That's you announcing that you're boring and that you decided not to think about why you felt bored while you played a game. None of the arguments I've seen about this game's genre have been convincing to me, but that's not something that happens uniquely with Night in the Woods. Debates about genre are almost always inconclusive, because genre is an unstable way of grouping works of art together based on some qualities that they kind of sort of share. Genre labels are shortcuts to saying, this one thing is like these other things. But genres don't exist in nature. They aren't hermit crab shells that works of art find and scuttle into to claim as their new homes. We create these labels. Art can fit into certain genres even when it's using certain generic conventions to comment on those genres. So the lack of consensus is to be expected, but I'm surprised none of the debate spilled over into a discussion of the game's narrative genre. Maybe this is because sometimes game genres can package in both design conventions and narrative conventions, but fundamentally, Night in the Woods is a narrative game. So when everybody just casually agreed that it's a coming-of-age story, it seemed like I was the only one sobbing and shaking my monitor in a panic and shouting, "Are you kidding me? This is obviously a Bildungsroman!" I'm not the most annoying person. Okay, am I being overly dramatic about the distinction between coming-of-age stories and Bildungsroman? Yeah, you should know that it's actually fair to say all Bildungsroman are coming-of-age stories, but not all coming-of-age stories are Bildungsroman. Night in the Woods is indisputably a Bildungsroman, though. The person who's considered the father of the Bildungsroman is Goethe. The embarrassing thing is, half of my family, speaks German. Originating in Germany in the 18th century, the Bildungsroman translates loosely to education novel. What sets it apart from coming-of-age stories is that its character undergoes a moral, cultural, and spiritual education to ultimately find his predetermined place in society. Bildungsromans depicted a character, usually a young man, growing out of his rebellious stage to the point where he can accept a socially responsible role in a friendly social community, so says book person Marianne Hirsch. This character would find a harmonious place in society by shedding his ignorance and innocence to wisdom and maturity. In coming-of-age stories, the main character's childhood is nostalgic. We watch them grow up, and we're a little sad they're not going to be a cute, starry-eyed kid anymore.
My name is On!
Meanwhile, the Bildungsroman hero, in his childhood, is a little shit. He would go from being a rambunctious upstart feeling friction with his society to being an upstanding member of it. An agreeable guy who grows out of his indolence and stops stirring the pot. Instead, he starts to serve the soup. Bildungsroman are meant to make an example of their protagonists, to educate the reader on how to become an acceptable adult and what that looks like. The problem is, to borrow again from book person Marianne Hirsch, social integration in such stories can be achieved only by severe compromise. Bildungsroman would show a character sacrificing the things that made him unique so he could be mature enough to boss his servants around boringly. Older Bildungsroman were brutally idealistic. They assumed that the end result was good. Think about it this way. Sometimes people are not in harmony with society because society sucks a bit, and even people who grow up to become responsible can be assholes. Sometimes you're at odds with your parents because they're jerks, with your teacher because they gave you an unfair grade, with the police because they yelled at you for not being able to back into a tight spot when you were on your way to... all I'm saying is I know the guy's truck was expensive, officer, you need to stop barking at me. So, think about the message that these stories were sending to people. If you can't grow up, that's a bad thing. That's an immoral choice. You're being a stinkhead for not getting with the program. And this is irrespective of whether or not society is being fair to you. Older Bildungsromans assumed and promoted ideologies wherein maturing, integrating into society, and being less disruptive to society were good, natural things. And they didn't encourage you to ask from whose perspective you'd have to look at that outcome in order to think that it's good. Because the outcome, social integration, you can word that another way. Conformity. Older Bildungsroman looked at a unique little dude and celebrated when he abandoned the parts of himself that society would reject. These stories inadvertently moralized the trajectory from social reject to boring person who is exactly what society wants him to be. And that's kinda shitty. As the genre moved across borders and time, people started to borrow the structure of the Bildungsroman to critique the stuff that the original stories usually said. So many Bildungsroman actually criticized the genre itself that now Bildungsroman are typically skeptical or outright critical of the things that the genre initially celebrated. Now, Bildungsroman encourage audiences to think about what good there really is in growing up. Think The Catcher in the Rye. If Holden Caulfield has it bad, then just think about what state society is in. I bring this all up because I'm interested, and therefore you should be too. I think May is a Bildungsroman heroine that critiques the ideas that are latent in the original Bildungsroman genre. Look at the facts, okay? Is May's kid self a shithead? According to B at least, yes. May walks into the adult world and she becomes a big vomiting baby. Literally. May gets extremely drunk at a party once, partly to deal with her anxiety about being around someone that she got into a really embarrassing situation with in high school. She makes a huge spectacle of herself, pukes, and becomes a gurgling, crying mess. It's at this point, when May literally sounds like a baby mimicking adult speech patterns, that she tries to connect with B over their childhood friendship. She then makes a huge and horrible mistake when she forgets that B's mom is fucking dead. May has not grown up, and she is not functioning in her society as an adult. She's functioning in it as a baby. Next fact. May is a grown-up, but she is showing no signs of taking on more responsibilities. I mentioned earlier that May tries to pull Greg back into a pattern of reckless behavior that colored their childhood friendship. In one particularly famous scene, Greg and May have some fun in a forest. They draw blood, and it's very stressful. But Greg needs to grow up. He can't do stuff like this all the time. Angus, the delight, who is much more level-headed and responsible, needs him to get his shit together so they can follow through with their life plan. They want to get the fuck out of Dodge. Greg can't do his part if he's spending all of his time reliving his ridiculous youth with May. And he tells her this. He says, "You need to let me grow up." May doesn't grow alongside these relationships. She's static. Last fact. Every adult in Possum Springs is having a hard time, and yet they expect May to start doing adult things. The game makes it obvious that growing up would suck ass. Even if May wanted to become a normal adult and fall into a harmonious role in society, that would still require accepting exhausting work for the heartbreaking outcome of barely scraping by. Either the adults in Possum Springs can't find work, or the work that's available doesn't cover the costs of living. The adults of Possum Springs don't get to have much fun. With these people as her points of emulation, it's understandable that May treats the town like a kid would treat a jungle gym. She's expected to grow into a regular, upstanding member of society, but because adult society sucks, it's more of an indictment against the society than May that she would rather play than, become extra depressed. Night in the Woods doesn't frame May like a stinky head, like she's been bad for not following the road that was set out ahead of her. Actually, being a baby all the time is sort of fun. May can chat with her friends whenever she wants to. She gets to run around town like a fucking lunatic. The avid Night in the Woods player will see a version of May that lends her ear to the town's quietest, nearly forgotten denizens. She listens to people who don't have anyone to listen to them. Take Selmer's the poet. You can talk to her every day, and she'll feed you a little weird poem that she's come up with. If you talk to her enough, at one point, you get to listen to her slam poem about how her entire generation lost their futures to the insatiable appetite of industry leaders in Silicon Valley. What's more, keeping a regular spot on your schedule for Selmer's guarantees that, near the end of the game, she tells your parents that she really appreciated May listening to her. Even though she's not filling a socially responsible role, she still has a socially important role. She's carving out different ways to be an adult, not bending over backwards to adhere to some ideological vision of a good, functioning member of society. So, in summary, the game borrows elements of the traditional Bildungsroman and jumbles them up to make a counterpoint to those older stories' themes. Growing up is not a glorious transition, and it can kinda suck. It would be great if May could be the person that her family and her friends want her to be, but that would also be really dreary, and it would make her lose her core May-ness. The game shows that May could hardly be blamed for acting like a baby because adult life is tough, and even then, it makes a point of showing that she still has value in her community. Many of the older quintessential Bildungsroman, like those by Goethe, didn't really have women protagonists because being a woman in the 1900s put you in a double bind. Conformity means a little bit of a different thing for women at this time. It means accepting that your future is in someone else's power. But rejecting those expectations also wasn't the girl boss move that we view it as today. Women could barely walk alone outside without a man escorting them, lest they be mistaken for a sex worker. And there were very little economic prospects for women that could offer true emancipation, unrelated to their relationships with men, if they stepped away from their social destinies. So what could they do? Well, you could just fucking give up. Women's Bildungsromans have historically tracked characters in arrested development who could not face growing up into oppression or running away and being exposed and vulnerable. Their choice was literally between the streets or being wifey. If you don't like either of those options, you can't, reverse time and become a kid again. So the only escape route is death. Because death represents the possibility of an afterlife where, fingers crossed, Oppression probably doesn't exist. These protagonists die before they're locked into their subjugation, and so their stories, leading up to their final hours, are about how they establish a relationship with the Christian God, the original dad, to come to grips with the afterlife. The one place that might offer freedom, real freedom, with God as like the concierge of the Freedom Palace. Death was the alternative to the impossible reversion of puberty. It was a mock circular journey where these characters on the brink of adulthood could reverse into non-existence. Dying was like crawling back into the womb of the universe, and it was like abortion. Dying was like going into the sweet abyss of pre-life, into the fetus state, through the vehicle of the afterlife. In one especially emotional scene, when May's mom tries to get her to explain why she left school, Mom Borowski says that May wasted 18 years of time, effort, and money to the point that they could have just dumped it into a hole for all the good that it did. Mom Borowski effectively tells her woman-child daughter that there is no difference between her current state and that of a corpse. The prologue of Night in the Woods is a poem. Presumably, it's from May's perspective, and it's about her grandfather shortly before and during his passing. The poem explains that Grandpa Borowski passed away shortly before the beginning of the game. It reads, "He loved ghost stories and quoted them to himself in his hospital bed. One of those quotes was, 'They feared death, so they ate the young.'" Grandpa Borowski bequeathed a crate full of ghost stories to May. Diligently interacting with the bookshelf in her house every day reconnects her with her grandfather's memory and gives her a little spooky dose to start her day. May misses her grandfather, obviously, and consequently she's preoccupied with his death. The opening poem says that right before her grandpa died, he sat up in his bed and said, "This house is haunted," and passed away. So, all in favor of making it illegal for people in hospice to speak out loud, say aye. Right out the gate, Night in the Woods prepares you to think about death and ghosts. On the first day in Possum Springs, you'll probably check out this bulletin board. There's a bouncy ball. Very nice. Some posters. And a notice of a missing person. May's childhood friend, Casey, has disappeared. And while you might expect a small community like this to mobilize and make every effort to find him, the people of Possum Springs are disturbingly unmoved by Casey's disappearance. Nobody seems to be doing anything to find him. In general, everyone seems content to just let Casey's memory fade away until, on Halloween, May witnesses a shadowy figure kidnap another young person, and she assumes this is a ghost. When May tries to tell her police officer aunt about this, her aunt is at best apathetic and at worst annoyed with May. May, obviously, is freaked the fuck out about this. You will spend the better part of this game watching May embarrass herself and try to find someone who believes her when she insists that she saw a rando get dragged into the spirit world. Knowing that May can act childishly, it's easy for everyone that she knows to dismiss her fear as another silly game that she's playing. But for you, the unwashed loser with back problems bathed in the cool light of your monitor at 2 a.m, May's interpretation starts to look like it has some substance to it. May's grandfather, Bee's mother, the possibly abducted young people, they all background everything in this game with death. One of May's neighbors, Mr. Chazikov, exists almost exclusively on a rooftop. Every few days, you can climb up to visit him and look at constellations in his telescope. When May finds one, Mr. Chazikov will tell her the story behind it with a neat little moral to share. My favorite of these stories is the one of Sterling the Seer. Mr. Chazikov says that Sterling was once the trusted sage of a king. One day, his king met a new sage, an astronomer, and because he had a better explanation for how space and shit works, the king booted Sterling out of their treehouse kingdom. At first, May is indifferent to Sterling's fate, shrugging it off as inevitable. Then Mr. Chazikov asks her, "So you think some people should go hungry and without homes once they're no longer useful to those in power?" "Mr. Chazikov, you make a good point there, little sir. For one thing, nobody is really useless. As we've seen, even May, in her lazy lump of an existence, has her role in the community. But more than that, it's a bit of a stretch to say that people deserve to be deprived of food and shelter if they're like May. So while Sterling being turned out to the streets may seem like a win for science, when his story is framed this way, it's comparable to the miners who used to be the economic spine of Possum Springs. Or actually to Possum Springs as a whole. Nobody in Possum Springs is really valued in the wider economy anymore. Many of them have lots of knowledge about the town, about mining. It's just knowledge that's not as valuable as, like, say, the knowledge of making apps. They've effectively been discarded by the entire country. Once it was decided that their knowledge was obsolete, the people of Possum Springs were left to just wither away. This isn't the only time the game draws parallels between religious people whose knowledge has been rendered obsolete by the primacy of scientific discourse, and workers whose skills were rendered obsolete when the US economy shifted from manufacturing to service. May can visit a lady named Rosa, who I'm pretty sure bumped genitals with May's grandpa. It's not really explicitly stated, but it's kind of obvious. You get the sense from her that she fucked. During one of Rosa's sleepy reminiscences about her youth, she says, "Back then, there were places that brought us all together, the church and the union. Both the union and the church were hubs for community building and shared values. You could trust that your fellows in these places would think about the world similarly to you. And if you think about how unions suffered near extinction when manufacturing moved out and the industries that these unions had formed in died, that on top of how with each generation we become more and more agnostic, thereby losing that common gathering place in the church, it kind of explains why young people are so atomized and miserable these days. The only common place that we can gather and delude ourselves in is the internet." Sterling wasn't malicious. He was religious. He just had a way of thinking about the world that was different. Mr. Chazikov tells May that's actually one of the general purposes that religion, legends, myths, folklore, etc. have always fulfilled. They give people stories to explain things that are hard to understand. He says the gods are stand-ins for things that we can't control. It's difficult to think of many things, so sometimes having a symbol for all of them is important. Sterling, if anything, was a storyteller. He found a way to corral all those complicated concepts, like natural disasters, death, emotions, the planets, into big metaphors, the gods. I'm an atheist. I was raised in a mostly secular household, barring, of course, one trip to a Mennonite Bible camp when I was 9 and a strange sleepover running around an evangelical church. So I know, as well as anyone else, that it's kind of taboo, especially in atheistic circles, to show empathy for religious people. I think this comes in part from a lot of people being traumatized by their religious backgrounds. Atheists also tend to view religious people as a whole as guileless boobies in secular society. Even Big Daddy Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses, essentially saying it is the key to lulling people into complacency. For a long time, I was super contemptuous towards religious people. Up until a few years ago, I was always of the impression that, like, as an atheist, I was just the smartest cookie on the planet. At some point, I realized I was making a few mistakes with my thinking. Firstly, religion isn't the opiate of the masses. There are lots of opiates of the masses. Opiates, for one thing, are the opiates of the masses. Yeah, powerful people have riled up entire countries for the sake of their religious beliefs, but they've also done that for the sake of racism and the economy. The second thing that changed my mind was the realization that I was lumping all kinds of very different religions and the concept of spirituality in general under one label. My exposure to one tiny part of Christianity in my life didn't give me license to completely brush off Ojibwe spirituality, or Hinduism, or Zoroastrianism. It didn't even really give me the authority to dismiss everything that every sect of Christianity has to say. These are very complicated belief systems with regional, cultural, and linguistic variability, and people abide by them with varying degrees of amenability and dogmatism. Religion, whether it's organized or not, carries important cultural knowledge between generations and a deeply rooted way of relating to the world around people. Like, it can package historical information in the form of fun, memorable stories. Places of worship teach a shared language that people in the community can use to talk about the ineffable. Even though I'm not religious, I can appreciate that. You know those days when you're on a hilltop with the wind in your ears and you're watching a beautiful sunset and you kind of get goosebumps and you think like, wow, life. You know those days? Religion seems to tap into some ineffable force in life, the ecstasy of being alive, human, and connected to other living things. It seems to provide comfort in knowing that you're not the only person to feel that way. I'm saying all of this, of course, to get you to join my religion. Please believe in bidets. It is the moral thing to do. I'm also saying this because much of the game has May talking with others about God, thinking about God, and listening to other people's religious beliefs. An article on Vice by Shonte Daniels covers the game's spiritual dimensions a little bit. So far, it's one of the only internet things I've found that actually explores this part of the game. I guess I'll have to just take care of this for everyone and be a hero, no big deal. You can get May and Bee to hang out at the Fort Lucine Mall together. Bee confides in May that she's become less devout in her faith as she's gotten older. In particular, becoming aware of how the world works left her feeling less excited about the universe and more horrified by her own inability to affect it. Not knowing used to feel like magic. Now, not knowing means things might be going wrong, and I may not be able to fix it. To cheer her up, May takes control of a fountain in the food court and pretends to be God, splashing shoppers. And it works! Bee's laughing, and they're having fun, and everybody else is soaked and miserable, and things are good. Rather than wait for God to drop happy feelings in their lap as an act of providence, May sees the vacuum where they both hoped a benevolent God would be, and she fills it with her little caring heart. May can choose to go with Bee, Greg, or Angus on an expedition for proof that the teen that she saw was actually kidnapped by a ghost. If you go with Angus, he and May will talk about spirituality. Well, they'll talk about Angus's lack of spirituality specifically. Angus's childhood was rough. His parents were abusive. There were times when he prayed someone would come and help him, and, of course, help never came. So he sells himself as a staunch atheist, but something that's kind of remarkable about his journey is the way he talks about finding solace from his abusive family life by turning to a community of skeptics online. Debunking religion gave him something to solve. It saved him in a way. Angus finds a kind of spiritual fulfillment in debunking theism. He goes on to say that he doesn't believe there's really a God out in the universe. The universe just exists and moves along regardless of how we feel. Angus says there's only a God insofar as people have fictionalized one. People create these stories because they see patterns in the universe, much like what Mr. Chazikov says about creating stand-ins for complicated ideas. Ultimately, Angus believes in a universe that doesn't care and people who do. In between most days in the game, you have to guide May through nightmare levels in order to progress. They get worse the more anxious that May becomes about the ghost kidnapper. The worst part about it is the way that they end. Immense horrors rise up out of the ground. Their screeches seem to initiate the end of the world, and then May wakes up. Eventually, May speaks with one of these creatures in her dream. She assumes that it's God, but then the creature tells her that it isn't God. It's cold, apathetic, disdainful, very different from the Christian God that May's been exposed to for her whole life, so she is inclined to believe it when it tells her that it's not God. It says, "Little creatures think that it's God, and I ask what God is, and they are telling me, and I am not this God, and this God is nowhere." May responds, "That's where faith comes in, I guess." For May, faith is just believing in God even when you don't have evidence. And then Not God says, "Little creatures are explaining faith, and moments ago is the beginning, and I am here then and here now, and there is nowhere for God to be hiding." Finally, May asks, "What am I doing here?" And Not God replies, "Monstrous existence. There is a hole at the center of everything, and it is always growing. The universe is forgetting you and being forgotten. There's nothing to remember it." May's only question is heartbreaking. What about the trees in the fall? What about leaves? What about my friends and family? This is May's plea for the creature to tell her that existence matters. But Not God replies, "Your atoms are not caring if you are existing. Your atoms are monstrous existence." After this, May is weighed down, both by the gravity of her existential nightmares and the knowledge that someone has been kidnapped, but nobody cares. Everything seems too big to be within her control. In an effort to find someone who can help her somehow, who can provide her a modicum of comfort, she tries to talk to Pastor Karen. She wants reassurance that not God really wasn't God. The conversation doesn't go the way that she hopes. Pastor Karen admits that even she's not 100% sure God is real. She experiences doubt just like anybody else. May is infuriated by this, that a representative of the church would lie about the one thing that she's supposed to be certain about. The pastor sees her own duty to serve the community as separate from her personal waxing and waning belief in a benevolent God, though. So, May just leaves, frustrated. In the game's finale, May tries to strike out alone and figure out what the fuck happened with this ghost situation. Her friends catch up with her, and in a really heartwarming moment, they tell her she's not going alone. And whether or not they're all actually anticipating meeting a ghost in this place, they head deep into the forest, and what they find there completely rocks their world. A cult has been kidnapping young people who seem to have no future, and throwing them into a hole in the mines as sacrifices to appease an eldritch god, the Black Goat. They've been sacrificing people since the 80s. Apparently a few people had stumbled upon the mine back then, and when one of them fell into the pit, the survivor reported hearing the voice of a god from below. The cult formed around this story, swearing that the sacrifices were improving things, bringing money back into the town. This, ultimately, is why they do it. The jobs were gone. Our kids were leaving. The government didn't care. They only wanted our votes, and they were spending taxes on lazy people and immigrants. None of these things are really true, of course. When the world moved on, Possum Springs was left behind almost arbitrarily, and if it ever revives, its continuation will be just as arbitrary, lazy people or not. What's even more unsettling is the way the cult says they're doing this to make sure kids stay in town. But at the same time, they view the people they sacrifice as disposable lowlifes. You find out at this point what happened to Casey. The cult kidnapped him and threw him in the pit. They said he was basically a worthless lowlife. This revelation throws Greg into a nearly murderous rage. Casey was one of his dearest friends. The cult's ideology is full of contradictions. They don't want young people to leave the town because they're effectively taking the future with them. At the same time, rather than help some of the young people who might be struggling and who do live there already, the cult sacrifices them, valuing their lives as less worthy. In the hopes of preserving the way of life that they cherish, the cult is killing it, because these ways of life cannot be passed down without someone to pass them down. The cult chucks their neighbors into a hole, hoping that this will somehow make their own lives better. They try to fend off the inevitable end of Possum Springs, long enough that they won't have to live to see it at least. They very literally fear death, so they eat the young. In his video on Night in the Woods, SuperBunnyHop says something like, the real antagonist of the game isn't an eldritch god, it's the system.
The real antagonist, I feel, is less of a villain hiding out there in the woods than it is abstract concepts like nostalgia and economic recessions.
And that's true. There's not some mustachioed villain convincing everyone to go on a crusade to please a god that he made up. But my interpretation is a little bit different. I mean, the Black Goat is a stand-in for things that the people can't control. I think, though, what we have to acknowledge is this economic system is experienced by the residents of Possum Springs like an apathetic god. People's socioeconomic conditions are determined by a force, something so powerful and beyond their individual influence that it might as well be supernatural. Like, if you're a layperson, try to explain this. Where is the economy? If you were to try to explain it, it wouldn't sound far off from the way people talk about gods. God is in all of us. And when I'm adding stickers to my Etsy cart but not buying them, apparently that's the economy too? And it's detrimental to the economy? The economy is located in exchanging gifts, in buying shit, in moving fucking giant boats through cramped canals, Wall Street, and your phones. It's in your pocket and your town, your country. It's in Elon Musk's tweets. It's everything, everywhere. Every decision that anybody makes is the economy, basically. This is why, when the city council yammers on about getting the attention of the market, they're the cult. I mean, not literally, but they talk about the market like it's an autonomous agent. Just like the cult, they believe that following through with some ritual will prove their worth in the estimation of an incorporeal observer. When it comes time to talk about actually solving problems in this monstrous existence that we're all living in, all we can do is consume the young and give ourselves up to something. Most of the young people are experiencing this antipathy from the older generation, even if the cult hasn't thrown them to the goat yet. If you choose to hang out with Greg, he explains that he and Angus are effectively planning to leave the city because they have to. He points out that nobody even tries to convince young people to stay anymore because nobody is under the illusion that there are any opportunities left in Possum Springs. The older generation is aggressively apathetic to the plight of the young people. They are doing absolutely nothing to make things easier for them. And yet, the town's lack of prosperity is being pinned on young people. Somebody vandalizes one of the murals, and without proof, the city council assumes it's the teenagers, and if it was, the kids have nowhere to go but hang out in a wet tunnel. Of course they're gonna graffiti something. No one talks about finding other occupations for the kids to keep them happy and to make them want to stay here. They talk about creating an image that closely reflects the glorious history of the town. It's this hyper-traditionalism that contributes to the millennial and Gen Z malaise. Our future lives, and therefore our present ones, are consumed by previous generations, by their idealism, by their rigid adherence to tradition. They thought they could avoid the death of their ways of life by never thinking about what was actually jeopardizing it, and in so doing, they were also creating an unsustainable world order. Yes, the real enemy is capitalism, and the black goat is largely a metaphor for that, but debating about whether or not the Eldritch God is real ignores the big point here. For people who have absolutely no power, this religious language captures the feeling and scope of the problem. The Black Goat and the cult are like one of Mr. Chazakov's stories. They are stand-ins for many things that are difficult to think about. This is kind of how our time will be represented to distant future generations. It's going to be the story that we tell each other when this shit becomes too big to make sense of. It already is. The god in Night in the Woods is capitalism. This, for me, is where religion stops serving a purpose. Religion is useful for keeping people connected. It's useful for handing down cultural values, for creating a shared vocabulary with which to talk about the ineffable. It's useful for providing comfort. In that way, it's useful for remembering why you carry on, for keeping hope alive. But the economy is not a god, as much as we might talk about it like it is. It's an extremely complicated network of interactions, and it does not predate humanity. Things have not always been this way, and they will not always be this way. This aspect of the game reminds me that we treat the economy and so many other parts of the architecture of society like they can't be changed, so there's no point in even trying to approach them like they can be. But what we need to be able to do is imagine something different as possible if we're ever going to be able to start fixing the problems that plague us. If you get May to hang out with Bee enough, at one point she asks Bee what her father actually does at the family store, because Bee seems to do all the work, and he never seems to actually be there. May scolds Bee for not standing up for herself, and urges her to talk to her dad and ask him for more authority over the store, or threaten to walk away. Bee gets annoyed by May's needling, and she tells May a story about how, when Bee was 15, a store employee, repair guy Creek, told her dad that he wanted to teach Bee to drive. Afterwards, Bee's dad told her never to be alone with Creek, and you're left to infer that Bee's dad got creepy vibes from Creek. Bee doesn't have the power to fire the guy, and even if she could, Creek keeps the team at the store afloat since her dad does absolutely nothing. Creek also has a family, and if he lost his job, they would lose their only reliable income stream. May, correctly, tells Bee that she shouldn't have to live with this threat of potentially being sexually assaulted hanging over her forever. She should try to get out of this situation. Bee also correctly tells May people can't always choose to do the thing that May thinks is right. And the game gives you two options to respond to Bee. You always have a choice, or you can always choose. You can see in my gameplay footage I flicked back and forth between these options because they were so cringy, so tactless. The game bluntly shows you that you can sometimes only choose between two equally horrible options, and their horribleness drains them of their distinction. You're almost for the worse by making the choice. B roasts May. Says the child woman with no job, no rent, no responsibilities, and no consequences for your stupid actions. B's situation is complicated. She has obligations to her father in spite of the way that he's been treating her. He hasn't been a good and mindful parent to her. Otherwise, he might have fired repair guy Creek as soon as he noticed he could pose a danger to B. Then again, he probably kept Creek on for the same reason that B wouldn't get rid of him. He is creepy, clearly, but there are no laws against general creepiness, so what could they do even if they did fire him? They wouldn't have a legal base to their decision. Creek also has people whose well-being depends on him working, so even if Creek did escalate his creepiness to outright violence, the only punishment the community can use is prison, and by extension, throwing Creek's whole family into poverty. If Creek is caught, his whole family will suffer. Do they deserve to starve because of Creek? Does Creek deserve to, go to prison for being creepy? What choice does B have, knowing all of this? Night in the Woods was developed primarily by 3 people who named their team Infinite Fall: Scott Benson, Bethany Hockenberry, and Alec Holoka. 2 years after its release, in August of 2019, game developer Zoe Quinn tweeted that Alec had abused and assaulted them in 2012, while the two were living together in Alec's hometown, Winnipeg. Within the next 4 days, Scott and Bethany announced their decision to cut ties with Alec and suspend their work on Night in the Woods. Alec returned home to Winnipeg where, on August 30th, he committed suicide. Alec's sister, Eileen, tweeted that Alec had his own experiences with abuse, implying that this contributed to the harm that he had caused. She also made one important comment that I want to emphasize here. In case it's not fucking obvious, Alec specifically said he wished the best for Zoe and everyone else. So don't use our grief as an excuse to harass people. Go outside, take care of someone, and work towards preventing these kinds of things in the first place. What do you think internet users did? They started using this grief as an excuse to harass Zoe and everyone else. To this day, there are replies to Eileen's tweet blaming Zoe for Alec's suicide. Many people also criticized Scott and Bethany for cutting ties, saying they shouldn't acquiesce to cancel culture. Some people's first comments were that we're not going to get a Night in the Woods 2 now, so of course everybody's priorities were in order. The internet analyzed the public-facing personas of every human being who was caught up in this scandal, to the point where Scott was pushed to write in detail about it. On September 3rd, 2019, Scott released a statement clearing up some misconceptions and addressing some of the toxic comments we sampled just a moment ago with far more grace than I would have been able to muster. Where many people had accused Scott and Bethany of firing Alec on hearsay, Scott explained that Infinite Fall wasn't a formal company that employed Alec, so they literally couldn't fire him. It was just a name they had created for their team. In spite of the internet's speculation, Scott and Bethany weren't making their decision not to associate with Alec solely off of what Zoe had tweeted. I'm not going to read either Scott or Zoe's statements aloud. If you've had these kinds of experiences, you get it, and if you haven't, you can go read what these people have to say. In my view, what Scott details here is more than enough of a reason for him and Bethany to not want to work with Alec. Scott explains that, for a while, he didn't even recognize that what he had gone through with Alec was abuse because of the grip that some cultural prejudices had on him. It was hard to admit to himself that, as a man, he could have been abused. To understate Scott's story, the team generally had an extremely difficult time working with Alec in the first place. Zoe's story just confirmed some of their suspicions that others' experiences may have been worse. This didn't stop the internet vultures from continuing to circle, of course. Okay, before I continue, I need to say something. As we all reached our own conclusions or believed everything that random YouTubers said about this and called that critical thinking, a lot of people at some point forgot that there were real humans behind this story. Scott, Bethany, Zoe, their loved ones, and Alec even, were not characters in a story. It wasn't the internet's job to uncover a villainous mastermind here. Alec had hurt a lot of people who trusted him very badly many times. His family had to deal with being in the public eye during a tumultuous time. The people he had hurt had to deal with conspiratorial accusations and constant scrutiny from strangers who were themselves working off of hearsay and speculation alone. I want you to try to imagine working through one of the most painful moments in your life while millions of people gibber about your eyebrows or how much of a liar they think you are based on the weird phrasing you used in a tweet 12 years ago. Really sit in that scenario for a second and imagine how everybody involved must have felt. Okay, let's continue. There was a group of commentators online, especially on YouTube, that made very particular criticisms of Zoe Quinn. I'm going to use this person, Sid Alpha, as my exemplar for this group. He didn't say a lot that was uniquely interesting, besides, of course, reciting out-of-context quotes from Friedrich Nietzsche's books plucked from a Goodreads tag about justice or liars.
Therefore I laugh in your faces with my laughter of the heights. Therefore I tear at your webs, that your rage may lure you out of your lie holes, and your revenge may leap out from behind your word of justice. For that man be...
The thing is, it's not really useful for our purposes to talk about a nebulous other perspective. Unfortunately, if I don't anchor myself in a real person's voice, you could just fill in what I'm talking about with anybody that you disapprove of. And that wouldn't be very responsible of me. Sid Alpha, like many of the other vultures that circled around this tragedy when it was still fresh in everybody's minds, was very concerned that the way Zoe Quinn handled their abuse story was negligent and connected to a wider societal pattern.
Now, I want it stated clearly in no uncertain terms that I do think it likely that the man was guilty of what he was accused. The issue I have, is with the cancel culture mentality of what happened, and the problem that such a destructive and devastating issue such as this being tried not in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion.
That pattern was cancel culture, and, it seems, false abuse accusations. Sid Alpha blames Zoe for Alec's death.
I hope Zoe Quinn's quest to remain relevant was worth it. It cost a life.
He ends his first video on the subject by urging victims to always go to the police when they've been assaulted.
The court of public opinion is not the place to air such accusations. If you have been harmed, go to the police. Seek out an attorney. Take it to the justice system, because of the guilty, period, mentality of the Twitter mobs can and have destroyed innocent lives.
For Sid Alpha, victims who bring their stories to the public before they've been vetted in the judicial system pose a danger to their abusers. Sid Alpha doesn't say assault and abuse shouldn't be taken seriously. It's just that most of his videos are spent focusing on how victims ought to be handling things better. These videos are very interesting to me. While Sid Alpha never explicitly says Zoe Quinn's story was a lie, his audience seems to have walked away with the impression that this is a story about a false accusation. So, even though nobody from Alec's most intimate social circle has voiced any doubt that Alec harmed people, even though Alec wished Zoe and everyone else well, even though Eileen tweeted, "I will not pretend Alec didn't cause harm," when you watch this video and others like it, you come away with this impression that we have a rapidly worsening problem with liars and false accusations. How did we get here? Something that's always bothered me is the fact that people only bring up the subject of false accusations when they want to halt the discussion of sexual assault, why it happens, and how to stop it. So let's just briefly, ever so briefly, talk about the subject of false accusations. Most of the data that we do have on false accusations comes from law enforcement offices where police habitually miscategorize cases as false. And that's not a judgment that I'm making, that's like a real roadblock that people studying criminal justice have to deal with when they want to collect stats. Depending on the department you go to, your real assault may be classified as a false accusation if the officer you reported to thought you had a weird facial expression, if you weren't bruised or banged up or there were no visible signs of struggle on you when you came in to report. Your case was assault, but your experience isn't codified as assault in the law of the area where you live, or you decide to drop the case for some reason. Yes, really. This is to say nothing of cases that are actually brought to court. It blew my mind to discover this when I first started researching this last summer. These are all real reasons why police departments will classify a case as a false accusation, like a lie. Hopefully, I don't need to explain how these are different from a case where the complainant actually lied. Researchers are put in a sticky spot, unfortunately for us, because law enforcement and the rest of the judicial system in the entire Anglosphere are so inconsistent.
These people will claim they resort to the court of public opinion because the justice system doesn't work, that they never get justice because such things are difficult to prove, and they're correct. It is difficult to prove. You know what makes it more difficult? Waiting nearly an entire decade before bringing things to light. In the meantime, leaving predators to prey on other
With this in mind, I will leave it for you, dear viewer, to consider whether or not telling victims to report more will stop the police from deciding that they're lying because their facial expression is stupid. There is data to suggest that you're more likely to be falsely accused if you're black. So, this isn't mentioned in Sid Alpha's video, but if we want to end false accusations, I think we have to do the small, teeny, tiny task of ending racism also. I was gonna scream into my pillow, but I'm sad now.
Let me be clear. If you have suffered sexual assault, take it to the police. The guilty should be punished in a court of law, not the court of public opinion. False accusers should face legal consequences.
See, where does that come from? The subject of false accusations isn't unrelated to this story. It's not unrelated to any story about sexual assault. Nobody will let it be unrelated. Some people in Sid Alpha's comment section said that they would refuse to believe anybody who came forward in the court of public opinion, in part because of their perception of this story. Because of the way Sid Alpha tells this story, surprise, surprise, I'm led to believe that false accusations are not the real issue here. He says over and over again that victims shouldn't bring their stories to the public until their abusers have been put in prison. If you bring your story forward before the prison step, you're in the wrong. Each abuse case is a standalone thing with no connection to a wider culture. All that matters is that it's dealt with in the right order. Sid Alpha treats dealing with abuse like a ceremony. You go in, sit down, play games, eat cake, watch the birthday kid open presents, grab a party favor, go home and cry. This is the proper order of things. Just like when abusers are put in prison before they're put on blast in the court of public opinion. In this story, the bad kid, Zoe, ate the cake before the presents were unwrapped, and therefore everything is done in the wrong order, and now Zoe's not invited to the next birthday party. No individual part of the story seems to be wrong in Sid Alpha's view. It's the sequence of events that's the problem. In a morbid way, it's kind of funny. Prison is a horrible stain on the face of humanity. It's an awful way for us to treat guilty people, never mind innocent people, but Sid Alpha's just like, the court of public opinion, it's terrible. Oh, prison? Whatever. I'll ask you again to consider exactly how Sid Alpha's stern reminders that victims should go to the police would correct the problems with the police. You, dear viewer, might even be wondering as you follow up on my video, why all Sid Alpha and the many YouTubers like him seem to laser focus on is the victims part of this equation. It's a really weird thing, because the victims are the part of this chain of events with the least amount of power. Something happens to victims, and for anything to happen after that, everyone who writes the laws and takes the reports and lawyers the courthouse has to be in just the right mood so things go into the direction of justice. Kind of. When you think of the justice system this way, there are so many ways things could go wrong, and this is because it is manned by humans. He treats the police and the justice system like they're cemented into the story, like they're not malleable pieces of the puzzle themselves. It's like the table the puzzle rests on. So he talks about the court of public opinion like it's full of fallible goblins, and the court system like the pure manifestation of righteousness.
These are the types of allegations that can and have destroyed lives. As such, I stand by my statements that such allegations should be conducted through a court of law and not the court of public opinion. Now, the reason why that should be a simple enough concept to grasp is that emotion clouds judgment.
The justice system was created by and is controlled by people, which means it is full of assholes. It is full of subjects with their own agendas, biases, flaws, and lapses in judgment. In Sid Alpha's framework, there's the righteous way to do things and the illegitimate way to do things. But this assumes the justice system is righteous, and it's not. It's not like these things are objectively moral. The justice systems in the USA and North America haven't always been there. They don't predate humanity or our flaws.
That is why our legal system functions the way it does. It will punish the wrongdoer. It will call to task those who have committed crimes and violated laws when people have been determined to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, to be sure. But its primary driving focus within its very creation is to preserve innocence, to protect the one virtuous man from being falsely convicted of a crime he did not commit.
like the residents of Possum Springs thought of the economy, like religious people think of the universe, like Disney thinks about celebrity cars. Sid Alpha thinks of the justice system like it's outside of human stories, as if it exists outside of morality. It is capricious and all-powerful and will only be satisfied if you make a show of obeying it. If you want to get the best possible outcome, you have to follow a very specific set of steps ritualistically, and you'll get what you want. Chuck the neighbors that you disapprove of into a pit, and the government will spend more money on your home. Send victims to the police, and then the divine hand of justice will guide everything in the right direction. Ultimately, I think the pain that surrounds this game's production isn't what stained it. The people who latched onto the wound and dug inside looking for gold spilled their horribleness across the community around the game. And while this whole thing sucks, and I don't think Alex should have taken his life, and I feel for his family, barely anyone even pretends to give a shit about the people Alec hurt. And when they do talk about this, it's to gossip like this is some fun urban legend. It's just so obvious that the majority of the gossip vultures that circled around this story never actually played the game. They admit to it, so it's not hard to see. Everything about Night in the Woods is trying to get you to think about aspects of society that are out of our control and what effect those huge things have on people on the ground who experience them like ants would experience an elephant's foot. If these people had played this game, they might have engaged with some of the questions that it asks the player to work through. For instance, how would you navigate Bee's situation? Even though Zoe wasn't involved in the production of Night in the Woods, I couldn't forget what happened to them throughout my time playing the game. Most of the game is not reflective of Alec's vision or anything, like he wasn't very involved in its production, but he was the game's composer, and because video games are an audiovisual medium, I would play the game with the sound on, and while May frolicked joyfully through the town, I would hear the cheerful ditty playing, and I would remember, the guy who made this song was hurting people. I've had experiences that are really similar to Zoe and Scott's, so while I was playing the game, I would just think of the times when... In a way, that's entirely my problem. Like, maybe I just need to get better at thinking of games like artifacts that poof into the physical world from contextless voids. Even if I could do that, though, I honestly think I wouldn't be able to forget about this aspect of the game's history because of the poisonous poppers who pollute the community around the game. If you go to forums or tweet threads or YouTube videos about Night in the Woods, inevitably there's always going to be some ding-dong strutting into the comments section, bending over, spreading their ass cheeks, and opening their gaping anuses to release noxious reminders around the community. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away, and they're always going to be there reminding me of the people who reacted poorly to my stories, so what are you supposed to do? Hey, just play Night in the Woods with the sound off, babe. It'll make your feelings go away. While I was watching Sid Alpha's video, I was really struck by this reference to this guy, William Blackstone.
There's a precept within criminal law called Blackstone's ratio.
Blackstone believed that if you had a group of 10 criminals and there was a chance that one of them was innocent, you shouldn't do anything about the other 9, just in case that one innocent guy gets caught in the crossfire. That sounds all well and good, although it does raise questions like, if persecuting people is so horrible, that it's better to just never do anything about the crimes they've committed, then maybe we're dealing with crimes in the wrong way, right, mates? Now, Blackstone was heavily influenced by a 17th century judge named Matthew Hale. You can actually see Hale's name at one point in one of Sid Alpha's screen caps. So why should you care about this? Well, Matthew Hale was famously very concerned about false accusations. The problem is, he also believed that marriage canceled out rape. Like, he didn't believe that it was possible for husbands to rape their wives. He saw marriage as a permanent consent contract that wives entered into when they agreed to, have rights on the condition of being man property. So what did Hale do to stop these hirsute heroines from spreading more lies all around the nation? Well, He did what any rational man does, and he projectile vomited his beliefs into English law, where they stayed until 1991, although his influence has been felt in some court cases as recently as 2009. The history of the legal handling of rape in the Anglosphere is stained by Matthew Hale. Now, all of that is horrible, but that's actually not why I'm telling you about Matthew Hale. Because Hale was a judge, he oversaw a trial, a witch trial. This particular witch trial became the blueprint that was used for the persecution of witches in the Salem witch trials.
In the Salem witch trials. Salem witch trials.
It is the new Salem witch trials, except there is no end to the insanity in sight. What this gaming Me Too movement that Sarkeesian was so excited for is nothing more than a continuation of what we saw with the Salem witch trials. Something I also pointed out on Twitter, and some dude stupidly proclaimed I was citing Monty Python. There's a precept within criminal law called Blackstone's ratio.
Blackstone's ratio.
There is no end to the new Salem witch trials, except it is the insanity in sight.
See, this tendency that we have to think of religious beliefs and systems in similar ways isn't just a metaphor that I've been cleverly pointing out this whole video. It's encoded into the DNA of all legal systems descending from the English one. As a result, we have inherited the way that we think about innocence and guilt from people like Hale through people like Blackstone. Like religious myths, the fear of false accusations is an old story. It's been passed down from generation to generation to help us make sense of things that are too big to understand. And one of the big things that's being explained away by these myths is rape culture. It's so much easier to believe that most people are liars than it is to believe that so many people could be abusers, because lying feels pedestrian and everyday. Meanwhile, abuse feels monumental and evil, but it is everyday. It happens every day. It's so strange to think that this story was called the gaming industry's Me Too moment back in 2019, because in the following years since, there have been so many blow-ups in other gaming communities. Not even a year later, the Smash Bros. Community melted down as it was revealed that so many prominent players had been exploiting, manipulating, or abusing younger members of the community. In that same year, several prominent Twitch streamers were outed as having behaved in a way that was very similar to Alec Holoka. And now, some of the gaming industry's leading companies are embroiled in lawsuits and scandal as it's been revealed that abuse and assault have been normalized by many people with authority all the way up the corporate ladder. And what's been frustrating to hear throughout all of this is the tone of surprise from people who should know better. Like, hello, where have you been the past 400 years? What historical figures like Hale teach us is we've been normalizing abuse for so long that it seems more feasible to try to tell people just to deal with it being there than it does to try to address the problem. The only reason these problems are being dealt with now is because people like Zoe have been brave enough to come forward and share their stories. The mantra "believe victims" has never sat right with me, in part because, it's the bare minimum. We should aim a little bit higher, but also, it's really vague. Matthew Hale technically believed victims, but he thought that marriage canceled out their victimhood. He just didn't care. Sid Alpha technically believed Zoe, but his dislike for Zoe canceled out their victimhood in his eyes. Even if we all agree to believe victims, that doesn't give us a solution for how to prevent more people from becoming victims. So I like to say, do something. Do something. Don't just believe victims the way you believe fairies are real or the way you believe God has your back. Do something. So what's my prescription? I don't know! You're asking me for all the right answers, and I can only give you the wrong ones. All I know for sure is that it can be daunting thinking about how much needs to be changed, and it can be discouraging to know that you can't single-handedly save the world. That sucks. Being abused feels like being dragged to the brink of the emotional hole at the center of everything. It feels like being asked to continue on, in spite of the fact that there's this giant abyssal crater laying in front of you, so that the foreseeable future is just occupied by this darkness. It sucks. And to have that combined with the knowledge that so much is wrong, it just feels like you're about to crumble under the hopelessness sometimes. In spite of the way that we feel, though, you and I are still here. We're still ruining the internet with our mousy voices. That has to count for something. So even though things are direly fucked, and I don't have any ready-made solutions for you for ending abuse, I can tell you how I stay hopeful, how I'm optimistic that things can get better. Just before May encounters the cult, she can go with B on one of her trips to a college town where B likes to pretend that she's a student and not an overworked 20-something. In one corner of the party, there's a lurking, soothsaying raver dispensing wisdom. They say to May, "The wise kitten focuses not on that which is lost, but on all that remains." Late in the game, you can take May to the church's archives and set her down for a nap. At this point, if you leave her alone, her grandpa's apparition will appear next to her and stay there until you decide it's time to get up and go. This is the only time an actual ghost seems to appear around May. You can interpret this like a dream, or as the real ghost of Grandpa Borowski showing up to comfort May, or as just an Easter egg to warm the player's heart. No matter what, though, this scene shows that there's goodness in the little things. It is a reassuring nod to disaffected young people that we haven't entirely been abandoned by the elders. This is one of the many ways the game tries to show you that hope lingers on in spite of the hole at the center of everything, in spite of the despair that you might experience by realizing the universe doesn't give a crap about you. Something does remain. When May and her friends flee the encounter with the cult in the mine, they're almost caught by one of the cult members. They narrowly escape him by collapsing the elevator shaft. As they wander underground trying to find a way back to the surface, May has a hallucination, a mystical vision. She comes face to face with the eldritch horror that she and her friends had narrowly escaped. The black goat from the hole at the center of everything. But this meeting is a little different. She tells the entity that on her way back from college, she had a dream of the last leaf falling off of the tree, and it frightened her. She says, "I'm scared, feeling like everything was over long before I got here." She understands this horrible process where leaves fall off the trees, where things come to an end, won't stop until she's dead. Then she says, "But when I die, I want it to hurt. When my friends leave, when I have to let go, when this entire town is wiped off the map, I want it to hurt. I want to hold on until I'm thrown off, until everything ends. Until that happens, I want to hope again, and I want it to hurt." May is the last leaf on the tree. She's part of all that remains, and she's determined to appreciate all that remains. Many of the initial responses to the game were focused on themes about mental illness, dread, enemy, depression. But I think this aspect of those themes, this optimism, didn't get enough attention. I think generally when we talk about what it's like to deal with mental illness, we don't talk enough about why we keep going. Because you know what happens after all the leaves fall off the trees? The snow falls, and it's cold and dark for a while. But then when it melts, new leaves bud all over the trees. It's my favorite part of the year in Winnipeg. I love spotting the green taking over the tree line right when the weather is warming up after the deep freeze. It's something that keeps me going. You know, a lot of people think that the antidote to depression is happiness. And when you're in the thick of it, you wonder, like, will I ever be happy again? I can't remember what it was like to be happy. But I think that's kind of a false idol. Even people who aren't depressed don't experience a constant flow of happy chemicals in their brains. Everyone experiences boredom, mild interest, anger, and pain just as often, if not more often, than they experience happiness. My very clinical take is the real antidotes to depression are these mundane little parts of life. It's all that remains in the absence of a grand purpose. It's when you're sitting near a pretzel stand and swapping stories with an old acquaintance. It's climbing up on the roof and chatting with a horror movie fan, learning lessons from the stars, or eavesdropping on conversations you aren't a part of. I think this is why Night in the Woods couldn't have been a cartoon or anything. You have to make the choice to hunt down these minute changes and sit with them, figure out why they matter, and learn to care about them. You have to find the will to live on, to wake up the next morning. May's mom tells her at one point that religion is more grace than condemnation, and I barely even understand that like, because it just seems like not the truth. But I like the idea of a faith in God existing everywhere being grace. The immensity of an empty parking lot or a quiet field that hasn't changed in 100 years. It's charcoal. It's your parents' house. That's grace. Life comprises beautiful, impermanent little things like leaves on the trees, chats with your neighbors, and walks down familiar streets. Even when you're struggling to find the will to live, you'll be able to experience these things, and you'll see the pain is worth pushing through. I think the game hammers home that focus on the future after the incident in the mine. You have one more day to say hello to everyone, and at first, it doesn't seem like much has changed, except Dad Borowski's coworkers at corporate grocery store are working on unionizing. It's true, the miners' leaves are gone, and Possum Springs is heading into winter, but come springtime, new buds will grow, new things will happen. Real, substantial change starts at the grassroots level, with plucky baby women. All the characters of Night in the Woods caught at this juncture between market forces and their own happiness, they can find little moments of grace even in their monstrous existence. I think that's a valuable thing to remember. When you're hurting, just keep that in mind, and take a deep breath. We can even do it together now, if you want. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Hello! Thank you for watching. We are gonna do the part now where I thank other people who made this video for me. I didn't make any of this. I'm not even in it. Thank you very much to Josie the Riveter. Josie is not only a patron of mine, she helped me pull together some research for the third section of this video. So thank you, Josie. I couldn't have done it without you, and you will find Josie's blog in the description below. And now we will thank the other people who gave me money, and I don't have anything creative to do for you guys, so I'm just putting nonsense syllables next to your names. Thank you to Thomas the Bombus, Pat Healy Congeely, Sheldon W. the Swelden W, Ben Hiltonen the Hill to Win, Josie the Riveter Smiveter, Cooper Jones Small Bones, Damian Mason running the Grayson, Eric Femi Johnson son, Joseph Abrams the Lightning, Shreya G Wiz. Okay, that's it. Take care.